Okay, I think we can get started because, in a way, it's a blessing that we're a smaller group because there could be more interaction and participation. And as a group, we can decide how we want to structure each session. What I had in mind was I need to ask for your perspective, and maybe we decide together how we want to do this. Uh, As I mentioned, I don't want this to be a lecture presentation like I might do for undergraduates or graduate students when introducing either being in time or some Derrida's works or some aspect of continental European philosophy. I mean, I could do that, but I don't want to. I have too much respect for your own backgrounds and work. A lot of you are faculty, many of you are doctoral students or master's students, so you're already fully engaged in your own way. And we want to hear from different perspectives and voices. But we should structure it in some way. So, I think for this opening moments, if we can just invite some perspectives as to how you want to do this, we could, the unstructured approach would be just to invite people to begin commenting on what they have read based on what we agreed to read, which is the first few pages of Being in Time, and then the first chapter section, subsection of Derrida's commentary on the origin of geometry. So we can do that, just how are people thinking about it, and then we can see how that fills up the time. Or I can take at least 5 minutes without going too fast. And this may not be sustainable as we move along to larger sections of being tonight. 5 minutes, 7 minutes, just summarizing as far as I could see, just me. I'm not teaching or imposing an interpretation. That would be tremendously that would violate certain principles, I would imagine, in a Derridean deconstructive sense. But it's not to teach or lecture in any way, but I can summarize a few points from the reading because it could highlight the types of philosophical questions we're exploring, not the answers. But what are even the questions? So, how would we want to do that, at least for this session today? Do you want me to do that quick summary, or do we want to just invite people to respond to the text? Does anyone have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, at least, and the purpose is again not for me to teach or to produce some master narrative that we all have to subscribe to. It's more of just because some of you may not have read, or at least recently, you come back to, oh, okay, you're just trying to refresh. So if we're just looking at it together, it's almost like we're looking at the text together and then we're having the discussion, is the way I'd like to see it. I don't have a PowerPoint or any lecture notes. It's just let's look at the text, kind of highlight a few points, and then we can go in. The other thing we can think about is people should feel free to leave whenever they have to. Sometimes I find that if we're in the middle of a very intense discussion, which we may get to, it's hard to stop. I'll try to go for as long as I can as well, but let's just see how it unfolds. It's going to be, I think, very difficult to do everything within 1 hour. I've already taken up 5 minutes of introducing the session. Okay, so what I have up here is the English translation of 1962 of Being in Time, the original German, and then in the English translation, some of you know French, the English translation of Derrida's Origin of Geometry. And that actually is in a separate, I have that here as well. German of Simon Zeit, English Being Time, and then Derrida's Origin of Geometry. The other thing is that I also have Husserl's Logical Investigations, all six, and in particular Volume 2 in the English translation by Routledge, the sixth investigation, which for Heidegger, presumably Derrida, even in this opening piece, it's a very important investigation out of all the logical investigations, but let's just leave that there. But it's there for us if we have to go to it. Okay, so once again, stopping, sharing. Just want to make sure people can at least view the text or see the text here. I'm going to go to the very beginning. It's the introduction, but Derrida preface. I don't know what to call this. Excerpt. It's not a preface. It's just this is the opening page of Being in Time. So you may recall this. It's the quote from Plato's Sophist. Some of you may know some Greek. Dulon garos homes me tauta, titote, leste, but the main part is the on, which shows up in the footnote 1 on Zion. Plato's present participle on, that is present participle of the verb sein, to be. So that's the opening quote, which catalyzes the whole work. So I think the main question here in Heidegger's sense, what I pick out here is, do we know we use this word, we think we've understood being, but going off of Plato's inspiration, even in terms of antiquity, we've now become perplexed by it. So he is saying, let's pose the question of being, meaning the meaning of being anew. So the question of the meaning of being is going to be posed again or in a new way, presumably, is what he's saying. Because he's trying to respond to even antiquity, saying, oh yeah, we have all these understandings and metaphysical concepts and ideas, but he's picking up on this particular moment in the sophist where everyone is now perplexed, as is Heidegger and his time, and perhaps all of us. I'll say for myself, I'm still very perplexed. So posing this question of the meaning of being, I don't want to get into the details here, but if you go through the footnotes, it's important to see the distinctions, Sinn and Bedeutung, Sinn meaning sense, Bedeutung signification, perhaps representation, perhaps semiotic association. We're going to go with the phenomenological idea of Sinn, meaning and sense, to keep it open, as opposed to knowing exactly what our language, all of our different languages, intuitively or even conceptually, if we reflect on the linguistic or grammatical nature of our languages, we may get into the details of what we mean. So it's not that project of linguistics, it's phenomenological. We want to get to this idea of the sense, like what's possible for us in terms of the horizon, which is the third footnote, which is interpretation. The big interpretation in German, Interpretation, as opposed to Auslegung, is the theoretical or systematic exegesis of a text. So that's the big interpretation as opposed to Auslegung is how does something become familiar to us? How do we interpret something in a situation or context? Actually, both important. And then horizon, the Derridean in us might want to play with all these. We could start deconstructing right now. But let's just, read these footnotes, listen to these English translators as they tell us what these distinctions are. But for them, they're saying in footnote 4, horizon is not that endless expanse. Keep trying to reach the horizon asymptotically. We can infinitely approach something and try to go deeper into it, even though it may elude us. It may, differ or delay itself, postpone in its arrival, to use a Derridean register. So they're not going with that something just extends or keeps going. It's more about delimitation, which is a Kantian kind of transcendental critical delimitation of by rules and principles of what's possible in terms of our cognition. Our experiences can be endless, but what can we actually think? And how do we lay down the limits as a project of transcendence so we have a greater understanding of who we are and what we can do? So it's more of, I guess, that kind of concrete facticity, that hermeneutics of that facticity that's important here. So all these distinctions. This is, I know, very fast, but the whole point is, in the same token, as we lay out this project and have our discussion about being in time, and we can do that, we'll just do that. The reason to juxtapose to Derrida when I get to it is to emphasize just a couple of points in his opening moments. And even though there's no explicit connection right now, for example, Derrida is commenting on Husserl and this problem of historicity and idealities, like especially mathematics. And so, what does that have to do with what we in all this? So let's just, in a Derridean way, they may not look like they're relatable subjects, but we're just going to juxtapose them, put them out together, and then let's see what kind of potential connections are there. Okay, the main text for the very first section, section 1, in chapter 1 of the introduction, which is divided into two chapters, chapter 1 and 2, that lays out the introduction before he gets to his part 1, which is got two divisions, division 1 with 6 chapters, and then division 2 also has 6 chapters, and that's where Being in Time ends. This is the introduction before we get to that part 1, division 1. which we'll eventually get to. But here we already see that Heidegger has a lot of hesitation already that this question today has been forgotten, this meaning of being, not what is being, ontology with an answer, not just repeating the history of metaphysics, what others have said about it, Plato, Aristotle especially. They all have their different versions, the knowing noesis, thought thinking itself for Aristotle, the form, or essence versus appearance for Plato. But today, he's talking about his today, and it's been forgotten. And if we just repeat the history of metaphysics up from antiquity up to Hegel's logic, they're just reworking the same thing. But posing the meaning of the question of being, he says this in what we just read. It's not just the question of the meaning of being anew, not the question of being, but the question of the meaning of being. He also says that means we have to look at the meaning of the question and the questioner. It's getting ahead a little bit. And that's going to turn out to be Dasein. Not so much existence or a subject or self, but this, you can just say for now, the meaning of this question is built into this questioner or inquirer called Dasein. Before we get there, he's opening up the book about being. He doesn't say anything about time. He doesn't say anything about Dasein yet. It's just being. And he goes, this whole, starting with the ancient Greeks up to Hegel, there are certain assumptions here. And let's just put them out there because no one maybe has really questioned the assumptions, the presuppositions. That's part of his destruction. That's what deconstruction is. It is not just reading or interpreting or producing meaning or coming up with master narratives of what everything is and telling people how to think. It's questioning the assumptions, which is great. It's very Socratic that way, ironically. So what are these main assumptions? He lists three. Being is the most universal. From Aristotle to medieval ontology, it's if you will, like a horizon under which everything else fits. It's that entity or that has to, any understanding is already included in conceiving anything which one ever has. Anything that exists has to partake of this much larger thing, even though it may be indefinable. It can be it has to be the thing that's out there that allows everything else to exist. And to use his phrase, ontotheology, and the way you can interpret ontotheology is ontology explores being, metaphysics explores that plus many other issues, time, rest, motion, time, eternity, excuse me. Theology presumably is the quote unquote science or philosophical explication of something like divinity or God. So what's ontotheology? Well, it is the metaphysical impulse that wants to see both being and truth and its relationship as something transcendent and conceptualize that. But it's theological in a way because it has that assumption about something that is, at least in this Western tradition, something that leads from ancient Greek metaphysics up to this medieval Christian ontology in Aquinas. But needless to say, it's universal. And if you're going to go with things that exist, you don't want to just, as a philosopher, you don't want to just say, okay, well, they exist. You want to see what is their essence, which means they're partaking of something beyond, which is the transcendence. There's a lot there. And he's not saying that that's what, as you know, those of you that have read Heidegger and understand the critique, he's going to introduce something totally different. Not that it's going to lead us to some kind of relativism, but he's going to introduce his own architectonic, his Dasein analytic and Zerga, and actually death and resolve and conscience and time and anxiety. This whole idea of inner Zeitigkeit being within time, and he's going to question all the great philosophers in the process. He's going to do something different, radically different. So he can't just, well, a lot of us have these assumptions, but we're not, he's critical, including up to Hegel. So that's first presupposition. Second is being is indefinable. I know I'm already at about 5 minutes. I said I wouldn't take one more. I'll be done. Believe it or not, I'll be done very quickly. Being is indefinable. Okay, yeah, we get that too. Not just nominal, but indefinable. That, it can't be in itself. This is the beginnings of the ontological difference. Whatever this strange thing, if you want to go with that first presupposition about Aristotle and Aquinas, analogy, transcendence, the partaking, the correspondence, the necessity of any entity relying on this much larger idea a priori of being. Well, one thing we know is that it's irreducible here in this precept. It cannot be just another being or entity. Good, that's important. But this indefinability, this irreducibility, the fact that it doesn't mean that we can't question its meaning. And it demands that we look at that question in the face. That's awesome. I love that. So there's also the beginnings of this project of destruction slash deconstruction. We're compelled to it. We care.
Excuse
Why?
me, sir.
Yes, visual.
I think your voice is very muffled and a little bit with a little bit of echo in it. Could you do something? Maybe bringing your mic closer.
Oh, okay. How about this now? I apologize. Is this okay?
Yes,
It's
it's
better?
better. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank
So to repeat, three presuppositions. The first one was being is universal, given the history of ontology, that any entity, if it's going to exist, has to partake of something higher than itself, presumably this thing called being. The second is this being is indefinable. It's the beginnings of the ontological difference. We're talking about entities, but we can never reduce this unnameable, unknowable, this word being to any entity. But that doesn't mean we can't question its meaning. And then the third one, which is the ontic realm itself, and that's where most people are. And we haven't even gotten into the Bay and Das Man, or we human beings. If you're not going to question that, the social scientists, nothing against social scientists, but they're not going to question the ontological nature of their human subjects that they study. But this is the ontic realm. It's just what people assume is the most self-evident thing. Linguistically, the verb structure, to be, we need it to say anything. I'm this, I'm happy, or this is that. So it's self-evident in the way that it's the verb structure that allows us to associate anything. But two, it's just the realm of what we think exists, the everyday notion of like, oh yeah, why would you possibly question something like being? That's everything. But what he says here is that we already live in an understanding of being, but the meaning of it is still veiled. See, that's the thing. We're in it. It's every day. It always happens, and yet we're still not questioning. What does he say later? The later Heidegger, the most thought-provoking thing in our thought-provoking age is that we're still not thinking. You know what? He said that 70 years ago. It's even worse today. Well, his time is bad, but think about our time. Okay, so those are the three presuppositions. I don't want to get into it further because I want to just quickly finish by bringing up the Derrida. And can people see this? Or do I have to stop? Introduction to origin geometry. Let me just stop sharing and bring it up again. So there's the origin. So I don't want to painstakingly read these first few paragraphs, but I do want to isolate one term. Just he's talking about this very late work, The Origin of Geometry, which is also part of the late crisis. But the main thing here is this paragraph here. The main question that's going to turn out before he gets to his registers of, and we're going to be debating this. We're going to all try to understand what is deconstruction, what's difference, what's the trace, what's the pharmacon, what's the speech writing hierarchy that he's going to destroy or upend, self-presence or self-sameness in terms of the speaking subject. For the Lacanians out there, you know that he gets one of his profound critiques through Lacan, triad of the imaginary, symbolic, and real distinction. But here in this engagement, this very early Derrida phenomenology, he wants to quickly avoid two things. We're not doing an empirical history of science. Oh, look at all these geniuses in antiquity, not just in the West, but throughout the world. Maybe the Sumerians, the Indians, Egyptians, whoever came up with geometry. Because once those truths are discovered as idealities, they're eternal. They're indisputable. That's why they're mathematical formulations. They're great and good. Mathematicians can have fun doing what they do, discovering new theorems and proving them. And once they stand, it's not like anything else. They don't disappear. So he's not doing the origin of these idealities as if we can discover it in some fixed past. And he's not telling the story of great people. On the other hand, because of phenomenology, thanks to Husserl, you can't turn to the structures of subjectivity either, the internal makeup of minds. that idealize these things and discover them, and with the intuition, perception of the first kind of genetic, if you will, he says that psychological genetic, like as if we could possibly go back to that trace and say, oh yeah, this is what that great mathematician was thinking before he came up with the theorem. This is what he was, in his mind or her mind was going through that allowed for the emergence of the intuition that then led to the crystallization of the theorem. So you got to avoid both empirical history and psychological makeup of subjectivity. This is so crucial because Heidegger is kind of doing the same thing earlier. And yet the word historicity arises. That's what's so difficult. And he says this here. I just want to read this paragraph here. But never had the two denunciations of historicism and objectivism been so organically united in the origin of geometry. I mean, this is Husserl coming to this much later in his corpus, not at the beginning. And Derrida is excited about this, but of course, Husserl doesn't get to continue. He dies. Where they proceed from the same impulse and are mutually involved throughout an itinerary whose bearing is sometimes disconcerting. Now, the singularity of our texts rests on the fact that the conjunction of these two standing and tested refusals creates a new scheme. Look at this. On the one hand, it brings to light a new type or profundity of historicity, facticity, finitude, not history with a big H, not memory, not linear time, not chronologies or calendars, but what's going to be very important for Heidegger in Division 2, Geschehen, historizing, and Geschichtlichkeit, historicality. On the hand, accordingly, it determines new tools and original direction for historical reflection. So that looks like regular history. The historicity of ideal objectivities, their origin and tradition. Look at this. In the ambiguous sense of this word, which includes both the movement of transmission and the perdurance of heritage, obeys different rules, which are neither the factual interconnection of empirical history nor an ideal and an ahistoric adding on. See, what both thinkers are up to is against the empiricism. Heidegger is going to do this too in his critique of ordinary understandings of historiography, historiology. Historizing is a movement for him. Historicality is linked to destiny and fate. So perdurance, maintenance of heritage, the handing down and the repeating, you get that in Heidegger too. But this problem of movement, which we haven't got to. Long story short, that origin, this is where I'll stop. That origin of the West, in a way, for both. Derrida's coming initially through Husserl. He's going to do his own thing. But if to come back to the Heidegger, where we want to start, it's this idea of, I guess this is where we can begin. We're going to question this questioner, us. We don't want to assume that the past is just out there, ready-made for us to understand and can pass itself down. We just have to sit there passively and kind of receive it. But we are making a critical judgment. We're trying to do something different because in the case of Heidegger, he's going to pose this question anew. The new posing the meaning of being as a question in a new way, but also raising the meaning of this question. So, and it seems to me already that the key issue here is, if that's the step we can take between the two texts, is even in the beginning, we'll go back to being in time. It seems to me Heidegger is actually talking about, in this very beginning, he hasn't gotten to section 6 on the destruction of the history of ontology, but is he not engaged in some, I wouldn't call it historical reflection, but some kind of ethical, philosophical, of course, question of responsibility here to take care of this question of the meaning of being? Is it not a type of historicity as well at work? Okay, so that's the question I wanted to pose. And just kind of share this here. If we want to start just from this beginning, tell me where you want to start. Do you want to start with the introduction or this passage in the very, very beginning? I can leave it up. I can come back to the screen, whatever we want to do. Does everyone have the text in front of them, by the way? Open? Good. Okay. Yeah. please take us in any direction and say, you know what, I totally disagree with everything you just said.
Uh,
Yes.
Raj, could you just, Michael, could you just repeat that very last couple sentences that you said about Heidegger taking care and an ethics, if I heard that accurately? Because it that I'd like to hear just a little more about that.
Sure. This is my interpretation, and this is not the subfield of, you know, continental philosophy or anyone in the humanities interested in this problem of ethics. Heidegger lacks it. Of course, he was a Nazi, and Derrida is an apologist for him, so he's problematic too. Levinas makes his own critique, but this problem of historicity not being a question of the temporal presuppositions that go into historians, us sitting here in 2026, Trump's about to celebrate the 250th birthday of, it happened to be in his reign of terror and his administration with this glorious moment. It's not that. It's not this, whatever people think history is in the big age, the nationalization of it, the glorification of it. It's historicity. And in a way, Heidegger here in this very beginning is talking about today, the historical present. He's talking about this transmission and handing down, hence the ancient Greeks. But if one is going to be concerned, and Zorga and Care is going to play a big role here in many different registers, both are concerned if it's historicity, it's about facticity and finitude, not just that we're mortal, but we don't want to be slaves to these three presuppositions about something being universal, something being totally evident. Everybody thinks it, knows it. It's totalitarian in that way. Hey, everybody hasn't questioned it, so that's fine. But it's also not, it's indefinable, which brings in that ethics and responsible relationship to the horizon for us to keep stretching so we don't become slaves to other signs or values like Nietzsche might teach us. So there's a lot going on right here for both thinkers in Derrida via Husserl without yet receiving the full translation of Heidegger. When we get to the 1965 lecture on being in time, which we'll get to, that may change a little bit. But right now for Derrida, it's historicity. It's not psychology. It's not about the history of mathematicians. It's not a simple idea of the origin, but there is some kind of tension going on in the back and forth movement of how we're going to engage with this very profound notion that something that is discovered as eternal or true has a beginning, but that beginning is not rooted in chronology, hence the problem of time, which will show up for both, certainly for Heidegger. And in this moment in Heidegger, it's just, if you wanted to look at these footnotes here, how do you let me put this back, Michael, and everybody else. How are you interpreting this opening moment?
So I mean, I could go on endlessly and confusedly about that, but I guess what I want to understand from you, Raj, and you're super clear, by the way. So thank you for just being as not precise, but just as clear as you can. But I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly in that, paying attention to historicity, taking care of it, trying to ask the question openly and acknowledging all of your presuppositions, that for you, there is an ethical dimension to that. And I just wanted to make sure I heard that accurately.
Yeah, and ethics doesn't have to be the history of ethics
Yeah.
or the Aristotelian, when we get into the Nicomachean ethics, for example. But it is for him, at least, he's going to end up with that last virtue, which is contemplation. But for him, I might say he's an elitist, but it's the philosopher that is graced with that by the divine, not anybody. The other guys, they just have variations. They might think they're happy, but the politician has to act justly. And he or she may relish in that, but they have to act towards others for their recognition. Hegel picks up on this too. But here, the question of the meaning of being is a very sensitive, gentle, by ethics, I mean something so gentle of a beginning here. Is it too much for me to say, do you see a kind of kindness? There's a kindness here.
I I don't think it's too much. I just want to make sure I heard you accurately.
So it kind of opens up it opens up the space. And for Derrida, it's He thinks that Husserl is trying to get to something finally, which is this profound, he calls it this profound question of historicity is arising at this time. It's very much a French thing in the 50s and 60s. They're taking in Husserl, they're taking in, I guess, two generations of Hegel by then. Hegel got there late too. Different Marx, Nietzsche, Freud's are hanging around, but Heidegger is late, as we know, the story goes, in
Yeah,
terms
I
of the
get.
early Heidegger.
So I'll pass the baton to others, but I what I like is about this is that it's in its gentleness. It is a contrast to how the the Derridean approach, Derridean, however you say it, Heideggerian approach are often seen as combative. We're going to deconstruct the history of ontology. Nobody understood it. I did. Ha ha ha. Derrida,
Oh, I see.
yeah. Derrida similarly is just going to bust chops on Hegel here, and I'm getting
Oh,
really
this is
colloquial.
oh,
Yeah,
this is
really
great,
colloquial.
Michael. I
Yeah,
want
really
others to.
colloquial.
I'm going to stay quiet now for the rest of the session. I am dying to hear what other people think
Yeah.
about their. Who wants to jump in here? Thank you, Michael. Zach?
Yeah, I mean, this was very interesting to me because I do, historical sociology, and mostly from like a Bourdieu angle, using like, concepts like habitus and field and things like that. And those are interesting in their own because they feel Bourdieu has his own kind of take on history. But yeah, I found this really interesting, this question of historicity and um, how that relates to being, because historicity, at least in my understanding, is like the question of like the mode of being of history, right? Not the history in books, not the history that historians necessarily do. Like you've been kind of pointing out a little subtle critique, right, of history in the social sciences, and how they don't kind of question that general ontology, which I think is mostly true. But the history that they're interested in isn't the factual linear passage of time and the place of events into this kind of sequence, that determines their meaning. It's the question of what is it in general. And I like this, how you framed it, Raj, saying it was kind of kind. Uh, it's kind of like a way into investigating these things to go back and kind of start at the beginning.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's
And
that's my take.
to be honest, thank you, Zach, between the German and English registers, history versus Geschichte and then Geschichte destiny, between Heidegger, we're going to do a lot of work on this between Heidegger and Being in Time, Division Two. We'll get there eventually, but then all of Derrida. But be clear, we're not talking about historicism, historiography in English is, historiology, I guess, in German, but the history of historical interpretation with every decade that goes by, there are going to be new historians of the Nazi period trying to understand the mechanics of fascism, but the different, same, or the French Revolution. You take any massive empirical event in history, and then it's the history of the changing historical interpretations and paradigms of the event. That's internal to history. Historicist, historicity is just the historical nature of history itself as a project that was born at a certain time, archaeologically, as Foucault might say. Hey, there's no history. It was born in the 19th century. What about everything prior to that? Point is that we're not doing that. I don't mean that by bringing in Derrida so early. We're here with being in time. If we look at it, this question of the meaning of being anew with the horizon as temporality and the structure of the entity being care, leading us to, yes, the individual Dasein is mortal, and then eventually this transmission of our heritage. It's taking care of the question, and this is not to be exclusionary. We have a lot of people here from the global south and the east. But if we're starting with this Western structure, at least for Heidegger, there's a deep, deep concern about taking care of something that was born that's so precious, but also hasn't been attended to. That's the basis of that ethical responsibility. So I see John first and then Samit, and we'll see where we go.
Yeah, I just listening, one I guess random thought that came to mind is when Heidegger does his reading of Nietzsche in the big Nietzsche book. And he's talking about the history of being. He talks about how it was sort of split into the idea of the essentia and the existentia. So, for example, a table would be brown and hard in terms of what it is, and perhaps badly positioned in terms of how it is. Like if it's in the middle of a gym during a hockey game, or sorry, a soccer game or a basketball game. And then he thought that Nietzsche sort of brought an end to this or fulfilled it with essentia as will to power and existentia as eternal return. And I just sort of relating that back to being in time.
Hmm.
He talks about in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics lecture, um, if we're thinking about present at hand and ready to hand, well, present at hand may not be seen directly, but we see it indirectly. Um, like, for example, if it's in dispute about whether the table is brown or not, we resolve the dispute by appealing to the table at hand right now. So you get this sort of play with Heidegger of things that you don't see directly, but he always finds ways to phenomenalize them, to coax them from hiddenness, which is, I think, one of the special things about him is I guess he was the magician of Mezzakirk or whatever
Right.
they like to call him.
Rumors of the Hidden King, John Van Buren. Well, you said
Yeah.
a lot there, John. It's we'll get to present at hand and ready to hand. Ready to hand is the comportment with the tools in Aristotle's forces. Fusis is the revealing or disclosure in Aletheia, which is all the ancient stuff. But you don't forget Husserl. Husserl is also very important with regard to, I think when you said that how the thing comes to presence into both intuition and perception is not this Kantian project of describing, the application of our principles or concepts that we're endowed with as human beings to make sense of the manifold through our intuitions of things that don't exist at space and time, to then have some understanding of basic things, whether they're idealities or actual essential objects. But for Husserl, and I think I kind of heard you say that the main thing is if there's historicity and if there's a deconstructive enterprise, this is not Heidegger's words, inside this opening section of Being and Time, because he's questioning those three presuppositions. He wants the irreducibility, undefinability, not to an entity. He doesn't want to just be told that it's analogy and medieval ontology, being to beings. He doesn't want to name it, so maybe there's a kind of non-Christian, if you will, because you're not naming the God as this single incarnation, but some kind of theosis, to use some Greek, but some kind of respect towards this horizon. But then we haven't even gotten into it yet, which is this caring comportment and mood and orientation. And for other secondary scholars today, the real issues aren't even being for Thomas Sheen. We've got to get to this question of movement, that what moves us, which is also an Aristotelian problem, but also and what relates us to the objects, but what are we as entities that are this kind of finitude of time. But if you're gonna go with Heidegger in this work, we're born, we die, those are the 2 points. It's the stuff in between. But even he's going to deconstruct simplistic notions of death, mortality, just like stopping or seeing someone else perish, unfortunately, tragically. I mean, he doesn't even get to being towards birth, as you know. He leaves that out, which some other folks are trying to work on myself. But it's the whole connectedness of that life, and its movement. So a lot of that comes back to this. How does this link up to transmission and heritage? And why question those three presuppositions? Samet and Sai, and then I guess Doug. I saw Doug come up. Yeah, didn't see her. So please, Samet, and then Sai.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. I think you partly already responded to the question because I was thinking about beforehand. But just to come back to this sentence that you were mentioning, the excerpt, the last sentence that says, "Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time, is the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being," relating to the discussion on historicity and time. Just like a very short comment that came to my mind when he says like, Geschichtlichkeit, he sometimes, not sometimes, but always is in a way referring to Geschehen, that something happens.
Exactly.
So it is in a way like there's an eventual character here that
Exactly.
he sees, I think. And also it is related to this, as you also mentioned, to this like orientation, because it is in a way like comportment, because like he's in a way talking about taking place, like l'espacement of
Exactly.
time, if we go to go further. But I just want to keep this term like horizon in
Hmm.
mind for the coming readings, stylistically as well. What he means by horizon, I think that could be another thread for us to go through.
Yes, thank you, Sam. And I don't want to jump ahead here, but even time, instead of saying temporality, because later it's going to be the meaning of this being, of this entity called Dasein, which is the question of this question, the meaning of being, is temporality, temporalizing, Zeitlichung, Zeitlichkeit, Kairos instead of Chronos, fulfill time. But you're right, Ignis becomes event, appropriation later. But time here is not Kant's a priori intuition of the inner manifold or sense that he said Heidegger's critique eventually in the later books, but also here is that Kant got caught up in that and he got confused and he couldn't really flesh it out. Hegel, he's going to end up with at the end, and this is my critique of both Heidegger and coming back to Hegel, is, well, at least Hegel has this connection between spirit and time, but what the heck is that with regard to its double-edged entity of nature and history, which is the end of phenomenology. So time, though, is not linear. It's not internal psychology. It's not clocks and calendars. It's related to the horizon for the understanding of being, but it's not just understanding being, which is built into this entity and choir called Dasein. Dasein is rooted in temporality eventually. So it seems like it's all kind of going in these strange circles or weird connections. Time is the horizon of understanding being is built into Dasein, Dasein's being is care is rooted into time. And we're back to, and then at the very end, division two, he gets into like, well, we're reckoning ourselves. And some people can take that existential route. And, the mainstream of Heideggerians and Heidegger people will bring it back to us, individuals, because he'll say that it's just me. He doesn't mean me, the I, or subject or self or the body, but it's my share of time or my allotment. You can't substitute it. I can't take the place of your death. I can push you out of the way of the train. You survive, I die. But it's not like you're taking my death. I'm the one that die. So that's the irreducibility again. But time and temporality for the later, I think John was mentioning 29, extematic, and then Leibniz book, and then the other Kant books, but eventually that very important book you were mentioning, John. The problem is going to be this, as you're saying, Sam, the interconnectedness of being and time. And what he always has been saying is the relationship. And that's a relationship of both finitude and transcendence. But it's not theology. It's not death and resurrection in Christianity. And for the natural sciences and social sciences that may not care about that question of life after death, it's just perishing and stopping and entropy and going back into Europe. So we need something more than that. And that's that against empiricism and psychological geneticism. By the time we get to the end of the Derrida work, he's talking about the transcendental historicity is God. Derrida, the 31-year-old Derrida. You're why what? What is that? What is that? And then naming deconstruction as a movement. So we're racing ahead here, but I would just say that horizon and time is, if you're going to question the meaning of being in the West, you also have to question the meaning of this word called time. And when Derrida gets to this Notion Gramme, he says, this is the problem of the West. Good for Derrida. Nietzsche said it before him, and Heidegger, of course, is that, you haven't come up with another, Nietzsche says, not a single new God in 2,000 years, the Christian God. How embarrassing. Well, for Derrida and Heidegger, no one's bothered to question this linear time and time being of three. We haven't even gotten to the fourth side of true time is four-dimensional, which is the later Heidegger. But it's like, if you could come up with a word other than time to describe what you're trying to talk about, you haven't. There hasn't been another word. This is the word we use. So deconstruction is essentially about this problem of, we don't want to be the slave to time. I think maybe John mentioned Nietzsche. Going on too long, I'm sorry. So I got a sigh and duck, but there's a lot to unpack there in that horizon with historicity. Yeah, sigh and duck.
Yeah. So what came to my mind, at least with the initial passage from Plato's Sophist, is that for some reason, at least Western metaphysics, began to think of being as full presence or as complete presence. And Heidegger shows that this understanding is explained to us or shown to us by the three presuppositions that he wants to destruct, which is basically that the complete presence of being is shown to us, or it is at least given to us as its absolute universality, in that it's present everywhere and that it's very self evident. We don't have to question it, and almost its indefinability. But this, I think, Heidegger would later in his works call the Anfang, or the first beginning of metaphysics, which considers being as complete presence. And it is this is a very critical interpretation that Heidegger wants to move away from in his later works, be it in the Beiträge or even in the Das Ereignis, where being is no longer considered as complete presence, but it's considered as a withdrawal or an absence of sorts. And this notion of immanence is something that I think has run throughout Western philosophy to a great deal. And even when we're reading Husserl's Origins to Geometry, we see that the transmission of geometrical theorems to some extent alludes to this immanence in transcendental subjectivity, where Husserl says that we are able to pass this geometrical theorems precisely because it is able to generate some sort of recollection or even reactivation of something that is present immanently in the transcendental subject. And although it's not exactly what Plato's talking about in Meno, where he says that we already have the knowledge present in us and it just has to come back through us through recollection. But nonetheless, there is this consistent theme of immanence and complete presence, right from this notion of being that has started from Plato up till the time of Husserl, when he's trying to do his Origins to Geometry, is something that I wanted to say.
Well, those are very clear reflections. And before we get to Doug, I can just say that you just hit on those two key points for Derrida, the reactivation. And don't forget, Dilthey is also important here, even though it's going to be important to Heidegger on historicality. But it's this: we humans are made by history and are making history. They're struck on the stretchiness of that. It also sounds like a hermeneutic circle of this subject, being both the subject and object of history at the same time. But this reactivation is not just psychological immanence that we study in a neuroscientific way. It's about this relationship to heritage that kind of haunts, which you know is a Derridean literature. But for the Heidegger question, you mentioned the two beginnings. Again, the problem with both these thinkers is that we're all trapped in our ordinary registers. Because you want to say, oh, that first beginning is 500 BC, Parmenides and Heraclitus, and Plato comes along, or Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle, and then it kind of ends, and it's just way back there. So that's that first beginning. But as Derrida says in Speaking in Denials, I believe it is, certainly in SG and Gramme, and he's saying it here too, Heidegger, that, okay, even in relationship to that first one is this problem of forgetfulness. That's how it began, meaning the ontological difference or the unquestioning the presuppositions. It starts, and people are racing to try to answer it, especially Hegel. And all these different guys have come up with different big answers to it. But we're not taking this step back. We're in it, that forgetfulness. And if you were to try to superficially say, okay, well, I'm going to unforget it. And Derrida asks this question too, like, well, you're going to just repeat, that's the closure of metaphysics, you're just going to repeat it. It's not a simple idea of like, okay, it's enough to say, hey, they forgot it while they began. And so the other beginning, therefore, is not just recollection, I think you said that, but also is not temporal in terms of an alignment. It's certainly not right now. The West is dying. It's like, if you look at our politics, and everybody, all the right wing is scrambling to like ensure that it has another 1,000-year reign of supremacy. So it's not that kind of empirical facticity of our present, but you can't just put that forgetfulness of that first origin to say, here's the other beginning. It's the problem of the passage in the relation, and you hit on it. I think John mentioned the Beiträge. But Sai, when you talked about reactivation and movement, and he said the movement of transmission, perdurance of heritage, origin of the ideality of the truth, the deconstruction of the relationship of all that. We're talking about care, Michael, and concern and responsibility built into this project, even though people don't want to see that. But the same with the Heidegger's two beginnings. And Samet, your Yamainikite and Yavalikite is the problem that we're just whiling, WHIL, occurring, stretching, happening between the two as the awaiting passage, because the Derridean limit is if Raj comes along and starts naming being, hey, it's this, well, you're just, each of the last night position. So it's a whole other orientation. This is where the East and the South may come in, pre-colonial, maybe post-colonial. It'd be great to hear other non-Judeo-Christian on Western structures. Is this whole other way to, so you don't have this binary of being and beings, or being and the questioning, which is a Western thing, logos. So what I'm trying to get at is that these are all interconnected themes here between historicity, care, the critique of the presuppositions, and your temporality side about the two beginnings is not simple, because you don't want to just situate yourself in history now. A lot of us here in the West are fearful, I'll speak for myself, but we're very fearful that the unthinkable is occurring. And this is precisely why Heidegger and Derrida are right, because of what we're living through, which is this notion that you can actually take control of history and shape it in the way you want it to be. That's crazy. You can say, oh no, Russia and China are doing it in their own ways. I don't want to talk about that. I'm just talking about what's happening here. Doug.
Thanks, Raj, and thanks for actually introducing our discussion. The very beginning of being a time for me is astounding in the fact that it's asking a question about what everyone presumes they understand. Um, I think it's really helpful to see how Heidegger in his studies really was um, working in the medieval texts. In fact, that was what he was first slated to do, is to teach medieval philosophy. And the idea is that they just presumed that we understood being, and this idea of what it is was the question for him is the constant idea of making it into an it. And so his approach here is now saying, well, Plato, Aristotle seem to bring us on to a trajectory that Hegel seems to be the apex of. And we're wondering, he's thinking, if I could, that that's one way of looking at this, but the texts look different and lead us in different ways. So let's start over. And so
Mm-hmm.
his questioning is really one of just opening up this entire question of what is being, how is being, and how are we related to it, and how is our relation to it somehow uh, driving it in directions that might not be what it is. So those are my thoughts.
That's great, Doug, because you might say Heidegger, being a modern guy, looks at the ancients up to the medieval ontology is like, wow, it's so profound. But they're kind of like kids. They're so naive, and he says at the end of the introduction before he gets to part one, hey, they started at Plato's Parmenides. Even Hegel says this in the preface, the greatest aesthetic achievement of ancient dialectic, or the ecstatic dreaming one goes through when you read the Metaphysics of Aristotle. You got to read all 10, 12 books. But the question kind of appeared to them in a basic way. It's profound. And their language, the facility they had in their language has allowed them, and the clarity of their logic to probe it. My powers are a little weaker. He's dealing with his German, and I just, not claiming to be able to answer this. It's just, but I'm It's like he's taking apart the watch that they created, but he's going to put it back together in a way that's so freaking complicated that nobody can answer it. So he's kind of, it's like, he's like copying out a little bit. He's like saying, well, yeah, it's good. They did it and it was amazing, but they did it in a way where they can attempt to answer it. I'm not even going to assume I can. I'm going to go down this path. You can follow me. It's one way. He says this at the end too. But the medieval ontology, which you brought up here, this section, for those of you that may not know, in the Habilitation shrift on Duns Scotus, it's not, leave aside Christian theology as the ultimate answer, the Trinitarian God, three persons equals one God, temporal incarnation of something eternal, procession of something that's the spirit out of those two entities. The three together comprise one. It is a mystery of faith. Don't try to metaphysicalize this or collapse the three back to one if you're going to be a Christian. And it has its own complex structures of, through the history of theology. So that's not that answer that Heidegger's talking about. He likes, as you said, the actual philosophical inventions that you might get from Aquinas in response to Aristotle. Or in his case, Duns Scotus. But in the end of the Habilitation, he ends up with Hegel as the most powerful, he says, Weltanschauung, worldview, because it's an attempt to overcome all the contradictions in the history of metaphysics and the Aufhebung, which is to negate those limits, erase them, which Derrida has a problem with, and raise it up. And it's not just negating the negation and the fulfillment of that conception, which is going to be history itself. A very complicated issue, as we know for Hegel. But here, it's not just the analogy of if the creator, the created is made in the image of the creator, or the distinction to make sure it's irreducible, to preserve the transcendence of the divinity from the impurity of the creation, but they have to have some complex relationship. See this relationship and this difference in the irreducibility, which was going to feed a lot into both the ontological difference for Heidegger, and difference for Derrida. It's the event of differentiation, but it's also delaying that temporally, so you don't have some spatialized view of what that event of differing looks like, especially in terms of signification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, he has his own complex. We're going to get to him. I don't want to say that Derrida is the temporality problem. That's the same as let's give some credit up to Derrida. He's doing his own thing, really. But so a lot of people will say, well, no, it's he gets everything from it. But this medieval ontology, it turns out, is also a problem of the relationship, the irreducible. He uses the word undefinable. Up here, as you're saying, indefinable, sorry. And up here, he's saying it's the most universal. The critics of Heidegger, including those that want to debate the late Heidegger breaking, this all ends, it fails, and then there's a turning, and he goes to this late Heidegger, is that he couldn't answer this question of the meaning of being. And Derrida picks up on this too, and because Derrida wants to lay out the reasons as to why you can't do it, but also what it means for us. Can we have a greater ethical orientation to our own limits? So, why continue along this quest? Is being a universal concept even in Heidegger, even though he's deconstructing the presuppositions? Because Derrida doesn't start with being. He's got his difference, he's got deconstruction, he's got many other registries, but he certainly doesn't want to say being. Is that a Western fantasy? Because other traditions don't have that. Who the hell has to prioritize being? Who cares about that? Care about something else that's more important for us. I'm being sarcastic. Okay, other folks, other perspectives on the opening of the text. Can we say we have a richer sense, if I can come back, just because we're just staying here? If we just give it another glance here, and I'm not assuming that we all can play with the Greek a little bit, but this to me is overlooked a lot. Raise anew the question of the meaning of being, but nowadays even perplexed at our inability, but are we perplexed at our inability to understand the expression of being? We don't care, it's the Das Man, nobody has time, nobody wants to be perplexed, they don't want to be in that state, which the great metaphysicians of antiquity were, pre-Socratics and Plato, which is why he has to appropriate them, go back to them. No, most people in his time, the 1920s, he's a radical guy. He's with the Neo-Kantians, this Husserl even, this phenomenology. So we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. See that circle there? Question the meaning of being. But so raise that anew with this new architectonic. He's taking a lot from the tradition, as you're saying, Doug. Augustine's going to show up. Luther shows up. Anybody up to 1927, 6 shows up. Just look at the look at the endnotes and also the index. But he's also saying they're not the one working out the meaning of this question, this kind of hermeneutic circle. Work out the question. He's not going to answer it. He leaves us with the question at the end of the book. Is time not the horizon for the understanding being, but is time the horizon being? He never got to time. That's division 3. And no Western person has come up with anything other than the 3, past, present, future. You got the temporality of Levinas, you got Nietzsche's eternal return, you got some Freud, you got Derrida's difference, and but they're all kind of hovering around this massive question. And the hypothesis I want to leave us with, I know we might have to close soon, is this is racing ahead, I apologize, but On Time and Being, 1962, short little piece there, cryptic statement that you don't even really have in the Beitrage. You have the leanings towards it throughout the late Heidegger, many places. You got the fourfold, for example, in the thing, and you got the order. But true time is 4-dimensional. That was supposed to be the reworking of this missing division 3. Or 2 years prior to being in time, concept of time. Now, what is time? That's the history of metaphysics. Get caught up in all those paradoxes like the ancient Greeks up to Hegel. Or for Kant, it's a mystery. But who is time? Who? What do you mean, who is time? And don't just talk about human beings who have a short amount of time and they get anxious because they may have to die. They haven't completed their projects. They have no meaning in life. I'm still unfulfilled as a 55-year-old. I thought I would be able to do X, Y, and Z in life, but here I am with these responsibilities. No, it's not the subjectivity of time, but this massive ontological problem that descends inside the West. Both its Christian structure, primordial Christianity. He's speaking to theologians in that lecture, and the ancient Greeks. But he doesn't want to repeat those things. He wants this at the beginning. That requires a destruction of that. But then who the hell is talking? Who's Heidegger? Who are you, Heidegger? He's not just Heidegger as his own Dasein, and then who's the Dasein? It's the man Heidegger. Like, who is a big problem for Heidegger, even in chapter 4, division 1. Who is Dasein? The Derridean in us want to stay away from saying it's you, or it's the Americans, or it's Donald Trump. Let's hope it's not it's not you. It can be about you, but not about the Americans. It's about Donald Trump. No, are we willing, Nietzsche's Superman, and then even the letter on humanism, to go down the path of the later Heidegger to say, we're not talking about the human being. Forget about being in the human being and forget about the divine and the holy, and then therefore anything like God, and he's not going to be religious that way, like the Christian God. If you don't see that kind of set of deductions that can put us in position for Dasein to answer the question of the meaning of the human, this is later Heidegger, then you're missing out on what the radical passage to the other beginning is. So no human being, post Nietzsche. No, we don't want to hear that. And that doesn't really show up in the early Derrida either. There's no statement about the human being. There's a statement of God, but not the human being. Okay, anybody else want to come in here? I know some people may want to break up. Are we okay with this format? I'm willing to do something totally different next time. Where do we want to move? Do we want to just move to the second section and try to keep reading? So that would mean, if I were to just bring it up here, and then keep moving forward. As I said, at some point, we're going to see a direct engagement of Derrida with Heidegger's text very quickly. So please don't worry about that if you're saying, what is this juxtaposition? But if you look at section 2, the formal structure of the question of being, That'll take us through the introduction of the term Dasein, the inquirer, not existence in general, the existent, not this human subject. He just says inquire. So that's that long. And then if I can indulge me, chapter 1, can you see the origin of geometry?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is not hopefully too long either. Although it is, yeah. Each one's roughly about 5-6 pages. And can we do this in 2 weeks? Good. And please email me offline ontology and availability. I don't know, Yassine, maybe you can have the last word with us to share your reflections. Would you like to? What is availability?
Well, I think I was chipping in. Thanks for opening that conversation. I was chipping in something that you or one of our colleagues told, where basically we do not question its occurrentness, but question it taken for granted and just the world as a kind of a given thing.
That's the pre-comprehension in individual being in the world. That's the
Yeah.
that's the thrownness already there, the facticity of already having been there. It's already there with us, but it's not there in a Heimlichkeit way, like a known way. It's very uncanny, even just being with others and the other Daseins, and we'll get to it. It's that ecstasis of even with ourselves, because it's going to turn out it's not just I myself, as he says. Oh, I'm my Dasein, my mindness. But then who the heck is that I inside there? Because it's always enslaved in the fallenness with the they. And he also says, look, it's not a question of breaking from the they and being a monk, sitting up there praying by yourself alone. Nothing against monks, but the day is with you. They're coming with you, even when you're alone. So don't think you're going to just magically break out of the structure of entrapment. The end history closure problem that we'll get to in Derrida. But the point is that this is not a simple matter. But then, was it Michael? If we don't have a definition of ethics and responsibility at the very beginning of this discussion, then I don't know what to call these two guys other than crazy when you Heidegger and Derrida. I see the exact opposite. I see this gentle commitment to taking care of the human Dasein, because there's many other Daseins, but the question of it being a human, if you're not going to go back to dogmatic metaphysics or religion, that we're ruptured from that. Both these guys are ruptured from their own upbringings, but he broke from his Catholicism, the scholastic Catholicism of his time, and that was bad. The other bad part for Heidegger's legacies is Nazism, which it's going to come up too. But it's not philosophy or religion as we know it. Okay, is this a good place to end? Any other perspectives? Oh, wait again, what is the time for me? Oh, yes, the timing, if it's okay, does 8:30 in the morning work for everyone on Wednesdays?